Have you ever wondered why some people seem to command respect without raising their voice, without even speaking at all? It's not charisma. It's not magic. It's something much simpler. They've mastered the art of not being constantly available. In a world that glorifies instant replies, emotional openness, and constant connection, we forget the quiet power of restraint. We think saying yes makes us kind, that showing up, no matter the cost, is a virtue. But what if this constant accessibility is not strength, but self-neglect? This video isn't about becoming cold or distant. It's about becoming conscious, aware of where your energy goes and why it's being drained. When you stop showing up for everything and everyone, not out of bitterness, but clarity, something begins to shift. You don't need to disappear. You just need to choose when to appear, and for what. Because when you stop being available, everything changes. Have you ever noticed how the atmosphere changes when someone simply chooses not to respond? They don't shout. They don't argue. They just withdraw. And suddenly, people start adjusting. The energy in the room shifts. Those who once took their presence for granted start to feel uneasy. There's a quiet kind of power in that. Not passive, not aggressive, just intentional absence. Now imagine what would happen if you did the same. Not out of anger, but out of awareness. What if you stopped reacting to every message, every demand, every expectation? What if you chose silence instead of a quick reply? Distance instead of emotional performance? That single decision, to not always be emotionally available, can flip the dynamics of your entire world. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. People often rely on your predictability to manage their own insecurities. Your reactions give them a sense of control. But the moment you step out of that role, everything shifts. You become harder to define, harder to manipulate. And those who thought they had you figured out, they realize they never really understood you at all. Carl Jung once said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to a better understanding of ourselves." So when your silence begins to irritate or confuse someone, pay attention. That reaction says more about them than about you. Withdrawing isn't weakness. It's not avoidance. When done consciously, it's a recalibration, a declaration that your time, your presence, and your peace are no longer up for grabs. There's something revealing about the way people react when you're no longer easily accessible, emotionally, mentally, or even physically. The moment you stop giving instant replies, stop showing up for every emotional need, stop explaining yourself, people shift. Some get anxious, others get irritated. A few even try to provoke you, just to pull a reaction from you. But here's what's really happening. They're not upset because you changed. They're upset because they can no longer use your reactions to anchor their own emotions. You've unknowingly become a mirror, a stabilizer, a buffer, someone who fills in the gaps for their lack of inner stability. When you withdraw, even quietly, it forces people to confront their own discomfort. And that discomfort often reveals how dependent they were, not on you, but on the emotional access they had to you. It shows how your constant presence, your constant yes, kept them from facing parts of themselves they'd rather avoid. It's not your job to carry that for them, and it's not your duty to be endlessly available just so others feel okay. That kind of giving comes at a cost. Your energy, your peace, your identity. Carl Jung once said that what we resist persists, and the more you resist setting boundaries, the more you stay trapped in emotional cycles that drain you. So when someone gets upset by your silence, ask yourself, what were they really relying on? Your kindness or your inability to say no? Sometimes it takes becoming unavailable to see who truly values you and who only valued your accessibility. One of the most overlooked reasons people lose respect for you is predictability. When you're always available, always responsive, always agreeable, it sends a message. Not one of kindness, but one of emotional obedience. You become familiar, convenient, easy to read, easy to use. And the truth is, people don't respect what they don't have to earn. When your time, energy, and attention are given without pause or filter, you unintentionally train others to devalue them. You become the default option, the backup plan, the emotional emergency button they press when their world feels unstable, only to be shelved again once they feel better. This isn't about becoming detached or indifferent. It's about seeing clearly the hidden cost of being too accessible, your peace, your dignity, your sense of self. Carl Jung described the persona as the mask we wear to survive socially, to be liked, accepted, seen as useful. But when the mask becomes your identity, you start abandoning yourself in small, unnoticed ways. You say it's okay when it's not. You respond to texts while exhausted. You over-explain, justify, and try to be everything for everyone. And at the end of the day, you're left wondering, why am I so drained? The answer is simple. Because you gave without boundaries. Because your predictability made you a tool rather than a person. Being predictable might make you needed, but it rarely makes you respected. To reclaim that respect, you don't need to be loud. You need to become intentional, selective, and a little less easy to reach. Carl Jung spoke of the persona, the social mask we wear to be accepted, to function in society, to meet expectations. It's not inherently bad, but over time, this mask can become suffocating. You wear it for so long that you begin to forget who you are underneath. You smile when you're hurting. You say, "I'm fine," when you're anything but. You respond to messages when all you want is quiet. You explain yourself to people who aren't really listening. Because the mask says you should be polite, agreeable, available, and so begins a subtle, almost invisible form of self-abandonment. You're not falling apart dramatically. You're simply fading, bit by bit. Every yes you say when you want to say no, every moment you show up out of guilt, not love, every time you silence your own discomfort to avoid making someone else uncomfortable. This isn't strength, it's erasure. The more you center yourself around what others need, the more you disappear from your own life. You start living on someone else's stage, playing a role written by their expectations. And what's the cost? Your inner clarity, your energy, your peace. True self-respect doesn't come from how much you can tolerate. It comes from how deeply you know where your limits are, and your willingness to honor them, even if others don't. You are not meant to be constantly available. You are meant to be fully alive. And sometimes that means stepping away from the role, taking off the mask, and returning to the person who's been quietly waiting underneath. You. People often confuse boundaries with rejection. They assume that when you say "not today," or choose silence instead of explanation, you're being cold, distant, or even arrogant. But the truth is the opposite. Boundaries are a form of clarity. When you begin to set limits, not out of anger, but out of awareness, you begin to see who truly respects you and who only respected their access to you. There's a harsh realization many of us face. Those who ask for the most of you often appreciate you the least. They want comfort, validation, distraction, whatever keeps their emotional world intact. But when you shift, even slightly, and begin to say no, they notice. And not always in kind ways. They might say, "You've changed," that you're not as warm as before, that something's wrong. But what's actually wrong is that they can no longer use your emotional availability to avoid their own discomfort. You're not here to be everyone's solution. Your time, your attention, your presence, those things are valuable. And when you start to treat them as such, others will either rise to meet that standard or quietly fade away. Either outcome is clarity. Jung taught that inner peace comes from knowing where you begin and where others end. When you don't know that line, you bleed energy, constantly, silently, invisibly. So no, setting boundaries isn't being harsh. It's being honest. It's telling the world, I exist too. And for the first time, maybe you're willing to honor that. One of the hardest truths to face is this. Many people don't want you. They want what you provide. Your validation. Your emotional labor. Your presence when they feel lonely. Your ability to make things easier, calmer, more bearable for them. And when you change, when you stop reacting, stop explaining, stop showing up on cue, those same people suddenly feel uncomfortable. Not because you've done something wrong, but because you're no longer serving a function they depended on. You'll hear things like, "You're different now," or "You're being distant." But what they're really saying is, "I don't know how to use you anymore." That's the moment you begin to see clearly. When you've always been emotionally available, others learn to rely on you, not as a person, but as a coping mechanism. And when you step away, they're forced to confront the reality they were avoiding all along. Themselves, their own discomfort, their own emptiness, their own patterns. Carl Jung warned that what we project onto others is often what we refuse to see in ourselves. But the reverse is also true. When you constantly show up to solve someone else's emotional puzzle, you stop them from growing. So when someone gets angry because you've withdrawn, ask yourself, were they ever really connected to me, or just addicted to what I gave them? Your silence is not cruelty. Your distance is not punishment. It's clarity. And sometimes that's the most loving thing you can offer. Not just to yourself, but to them too. Carl Jung didn't see the human mind as a passive machine. He saw it as an energetic system, one where every thought, every emotion, and every action consumes a part of your internal fuel. And like any fuel source, it's not infinite. The real question isn't whether you're using energy. It's where and why. Every time you rush to defend yourself against someone's careless words, every time you respond to provoke just to prove a point, every time you overthink a message or replay a confrontation in your head, you are spending psychic energy. And often, it's on things that give you nothing back. This is how people become emotionally exhausted, not because they're weak, but because they're leaking energy into conversations, people, and patterns that don't nourish them. And when you're drained, you become vulnerable. Vulnerable to manipulation. Vulnerable to emotional chaos. Vulnerable to being shaped by the needs of others, instead of the truth within you. Jung said that a healthy psyche knows how to keep energy within the system. That means learning to say no without guilt. It means being okay with not explaining yourself. It means recognizing that not every fight deserves your presence. Your power isn't in constant reaction, it's in conscious direction. The ability to notice your triggers and choose whether to respond, not out of fear or habit, but out of self-respect. Your energy is your life force. If you don't guard it, someone else will use it, for their gain, not yours. Have you ever lost sleep replaying a conversation in your mind, trying to rewrite what you should have said, or understand why someone treated you the way they did? That mental loop isn't clarity. It's energy leakage. You're not processing the past. You're feeding ghosts. Carl Jung described psychic energy as a force that, when misdirected, keeps old wounds alive. When you continually react to unresolved emotions, when you keep participating in stories that should have ended long ago, you're keeping those ghosts on life support. You think you're gaining insight, but most of the time, you're simply exhausting yourself. What drains you doesn't just hurt you, it owns you. And the more you revisit it, the deeper the hook goes. The more you feed it your attention, the more it shapes your identity. The key is not to become cold or unfeeling, but to become selective. Your energy is sacred. Every moment you spend feeding unresolved patterns is a moment you could have spent healing, building, resting. And yes, some people thrive on keeping you entangled in the past, through guilt, through memory, through emotional habits that feel like connection, but are really cycles. But you're not obligated to keep old dynamics alive just because you once cared. You don't owe your energy to what no longer serves your peace. So the next time your mind tries to pull you back into the familiar pain, ask yourself, is this helping me grow, or just keeping the ghost alive? Think about someone who walks into a room and instantly commands attention, without saying a word. It's not charisma, it's not mystery, it's energy, held, guarded, directed. Psychic energy, as Jung described it, is like a field. When it's intact, it creates presence. You don't need to raise your voice. You are the voice people notice. But when that same energy is scattered, through over-explaining, arguing, reacting to every stimulus, you become invisible, depleted, replaceable. This isn't about shutting down emotionally. It's about discernment. Start noticing what triggers your automatic responses. Is it criticism? Silence? Being misunderstood? Those are the pressure points where your energy leaks the fastest. Somewhere along the way, you may have learned that being emotionally expressive equaled strength. But strength isn't measured by how loud you are. It's revealed in how well you hold yourself when everything around you pulls for a reaction. Being reactive makes you predictable. Being grounded makes you powerful. Not every opinion needs a reply. Not every provocation deserves your energy. And not every invitation into conflict is worth accepting. When you begin to conserve your energy, something shifts. People feel it. They don't know why you feel different, but they respond to it. They sense a boundary, even if you haven't said a word. And that's when real presence begins. Not when you do more, but when you master when not to. Not all manipulation is loud. Sometimes it's quiet, almost invisible. It doesn't come from force. It comes from familiarity. People don't always need power to control you. They just need access to your triggers. The moment someone figures out what provokes you, what makes you feel small, defensive, guilty, or desperate, they've found a shortcut into your emotional system. And if they want to influence you, they don't need to argue. They just need to press that button again. Carl Jung called this projection. the psychological mechanism where we unload what we can't face within ourselves onto someone else. But projection only works when the recipient reacts predictably. That's where your emotional triggers come in. The more unaware you are of your patterns, of your deep need to explain, to be liked, to prove you're not wrong, the more likely it is someone will use them against you. You don't need to be in a toxic relationship for this to happen. It can come from anyone, a colleague, a friend, even family. Not always out of cruelty. Sometimes out of habit. So what do? Start by watching yourself in moments of emotional intensity. Not to shame yourself, but to observe. When someone says something that cuts deep, pause. When you feel the urge to justify, wait. That moment of restraint is where your strength is born. When you stop reacting automatically, the manipulation loses its grip. Power doesn't come from being untouchable. It comes from being aware of where you can be touched and choosing not to flinch. There comes a point where explanation becomes a trap. You find yourself repeating the same reasons, justifying your boundaries, your silence, your choices, hoping someone will finally understand. But they rarely do, because often they're not listening to understand. They're listening to regain control. The more you explain, the more they adjust their tactics. The more you talk, the more you give them material to twist, challenge, or guilt trip. That's why silence is powerful, not because it's passive, but because it ends the cycle. When you stop justifying yourself, people are forced to confront their own discomfort. Without your words to soften the edge, the truth stands alone, and that makes some people uneasy. But here's the thing. You don't owe anyone an explanation for your healing. Not for the boundaries you've drawn. Not for the messages you stopped replying to. Not for the invitations you declined, or the energy you've reclaimed. Carl Jung believed that individuation, the process of becoming whole, requires a step away from the collective story. And in that space of solitude, you begin to hear a different voice, your own. Let the silence speak. Let your absence mean something. Let people sit with the consequences of their behavior, without rushing in to ease it. You are not cruel for refusing to be emotionally available on command. You are simply choosing peace over performance, clarity over comfort, self-respect over being understood. And those who truly value you won't need an explanation to honor that. You don't need to raise your voice to make people uncomfortable. Sometimes you only need to go quiet. When you step back, emotionally, mentally, or even physically, it creates a space. And into that space rushes everything the other person didn't want to face. The silence becomes a mirror. People who once relied on your reactions to feel in control now feel exposed. Your emotional absence reveals how much they depended on your presence to stabilize their own chaos. And that can be deeply unsettling. Not for you, but for them. They may call you distant, cold, difficult. But what they're really saying is, I can't manipulate you the way I used to. You haven't become cruel. You've simply stopped cushioning their dysfunction. Carl Jung once said that we do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And sometimes your refusal to react brings that darkness into full view. Not yours, but theirs. When someone lashes out at your silence, they're often lashing out at their own discomfort. Your non-response removes their usual outlet. Without your emotional energy to feed off, their strategies fall apart. This is why withdrawal is so powerful. Not because it punishes, but because it reveals. It draws a sharp line between who genuinely values your presence and who merely used it to fill something empty in themselves. And once that line is visible, you gain a freedom you didn't know you were missing. The freedom to stop carrying what was never yours to hold. Silence is often misunderstood. To many, it looks like absence, detachment, even weakness. But real silence, the kind that comes from awareness, not avoidance, is a force most people can't handle. Why? Because it takes away the script. When you stop reacting, you change the dynamic. As long as you're talking, defending, explaining, you're still part of the performance. But the moment you go silent, you leave the stage, and suddenly, the other person has no lines left. Your refusal to respond strips away their control. And for those who rely on chaos to feel powerful, that's terrifying. Silence isn't passivity. It's restraint. It's mastery. It says, I'm not afraid of what you're trying to stir up, because I'm no longer bound by it. Carl Jung spoke about individuation as a process that requires distance, not isolation for the sake of ego, but solitude for the sake of clarity. And that clarity often arrives in silence. In silence, patterns become visible. Games become obvious. Wounds begin to speak. And when you no longer feel the urge to explain your boundaries, justify your needs, or soften your presence, you begin to walk with a different kind of power. One rooted not in noise, but in presence. So let others be loud. Let them demand, provoke, or project. Your silence is not emptiness. It's a boundary. It's a mirror. It's a declaration that your energy is no longer up for negotiation. There's a hidden price to choosing peace, one people rarely talk about. You will be misunderstood. When you stop explaining, others may assume you're hiding something. When you set boundaries, they might say you're selfish. When you walk away quietly, they'll call it coldness. But what they're really reacting to is this. You're no longer behaving the way they're used to. You're no longer overextending to avoid conflict. You're no longer performing kindness to stay accepted. You're no longer offering your energy as compensation for their discomfort. And that shift? It unsettles people, especially those who benefited from your lack of boundaries. Carl Jung observed that true transformation begins not in comfort, but in disruption. When the old patterns break and the new ones haven't yet taken form. That's exactly what happens when you stop playing your old role in someone else's story. They don't just grieve your absence, they panic over their own emptiness. But here's the truth you must hold. Being misunderstood is not failure. It's often the evidence that you've stopped living for approval. Not everyone is meant to understand your journey. Not everyone deserves front-row access to your evolution. Let them misread you. Let them think what they need to think. Peace doesn't require permission, because in the quiet of your own soul, beyond the noise and the labels, you'll find something far more important than being understood. You'll find yourself finally heard by you. Silence comes first. Then, solitude. And for a while, it feels like loss. You step away, maybe from people, maybe from roles, maybe from old versions of yourself. And at first, it's quiet in the most uncomfortable way. You question yourself. Doubt creeps in. Am I being too harsh? Too distant? Am I losing something valuable? But as the silence settles, something begins to shift. What once felt like absence becomes space. What once felt like isolation becomes clarity. And what once felt like rejection becomes redirection toward yourself. This is the beginning of rebirth. Carl Jung described individuation as the process of becoming whole. And wholeness doesn't come from adding more, but from removing what doesn't belong. Withdrawal is how you clear the noise. It's how you remember who you were before the roles, the conditioning, the emotional demands. And in that space, uncomfortable at first, you start to reconnect with something steady, quiet, and true. Your essence, no longer shaped by expectations, no longer stretched by obligations. You start living from the inside out instead of the outside in. And yes, you will lose people. You will be misread. You will be called things you are not. But you will also find something rare. Self-respect that doesn't need applause. Peace that doesn't depend on permission. A presence that doesn't have to prove anything. This is not the end of something. This is the reintroduction of someone you've always been. But finally get to meet again. There's a kind of strength that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't shout. It doesn't seek validation. It simply endures, quietly, inwardly, steadily. That's the strength of standing alone. Not out of bitterness, not from pride, but because you've learned that your peace is too valuable to trade for proximity. In the beginning, solitude may feel like a punishment. You'll miss familiar voices, even the ones that drained you. You'll question whether you made the right choice. But over time, that silence begins to heal. The stillness starts to speak. You realize that most of what you thought was connection was actually transaction. That many of your conversations were just rehearsals in being accepted. That your accessibility was being mistaken for love. Carl Jung taught that wholeness comes when we stop outsourcing our identity, when we stop letting others define our worth, our emotions, our choices. And when you finally reach that place, when you're no longer trying to be understood by everyone, you discover something powerful. You are no longer afraid to be misread, no longer shaken by absence, no longer willing to shrink yourself to make others comfortable. Standing alone doesn't mean you've failed to belong. It means you've chosen not to betray yourself in order to fit. You're not lonely. You're sovereign, and that sovereignty radiates in ways noise never could. So if you find yourself in that space, quiet, uncertain, but whole, don't run from it. That's not the end of your story. That's the beginning of your freedom. You've been taught to show up, to say yes, to be kind, but no one ever taught you the cost of being endlessly available. Not in time, not in energy, not in identity. Somewhere along the way, you may have mistaken emotional performance for connection, or believed that being needed meant being loved. But the truth is harder and more freeing. The more available you are to everyone, the less present you become to yourself. Carl Jung understood that individuation, the journey of becoming whole, requires solitude, silence, and the courage to break patterns that once felt like love. It's not about building walls. It's about drawing lines. It's about knowing when to step back, not to punish, but to remember who you are when no one else is watching. You don't have to keep explaining your piece. You don't have to soften your edges to fit someone else's version of you. You don't have to stay in conversations that exhaust you, or in roles that erase you. And no, not everyone will understand your silence. But the ones who matter won't need to. They'll feel your presence, even when you're quiet. They'll respect your energy, even when you withhold it. So take the step back, hold the line. Not because you're angry, because you're clear. You're not here to be everything for everyone. You're here to become fully yourself. And when that happens, quietly, powerfully without permission, everything changes.